In the rolling hills of Judea, where ancient olive groves still whisper secrets of millennia past, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of pottery and stone inscriptions that speak to one of history's most enigmatic and influential rulers, a shepherd boy who would become the architect of Israel's golden age and whose legacy would echo through three major world religions for over 3,000 years. The Tel Dan stele, discovered in 1993 and 1994 at the ancient city of Dan in northern Israel, bears an Aramaic inscription dating to the 9th or 8th century BCE that references the House of David, providing the first archaeological evidence outside biblical texts for the historical existence of Israel's most celebrated king, a man whose story begins not in the halls of power but in the pastoral landscapes of Bethlehem, where the youngest son of Jesse tended his father's flocks while dreaming of psalms that would become the foundation of Western liturgical music. Archaeological excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa, identified by some scholars as the biblical Shiraim, have revealed a fortified city from the time of David, complete with massive stone walls, gates, and domestic structures that suggest a level of political organization and territorial control consistent with the biblical accounts of David's expanding kingdom, while pottery assemblages and carbon-14 dating place the site's occupation squarely within the 10th century BCE, the period traditionally associated with David's reign. The material culture uncovered at this site, including cult objects, administrative seals, and evidence of centralized food production and distribution, paints a picture of a society transitioning from tribal confederation to monarchical state, exactly the kind of political transformation that the biblical narrative attributes to David's military conquests and administrative innovations. Recent isotope analysis of human remains from Iron Age sites throughout the region has revealed population movements and cultural exchanges that align remarkably well with biblical accounts of David's campaigns against the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, and Arameans, while the distribution of distinctive pottery styles known as Judaite, where suggests the emergence of a unified cultural identity centered on Jerusalem during precisely the period when David is said to have established his capital there. The story of David begins in the context of Israel's transition from the chaotic period of the judges to the stability of monarchy, a transformation necessitated by the growing threat of the Philistines, who had established a sophisticated urban civilization along the Mediterranean coast and were gradually expanding inland, bringing with them iron technology, advanced military tactics, and a level of political organization that the loosely confederated Israelite tribes found difficult to match. The archaeological record from sites like Ekron, Gath, and Ashkelon reveals the impressive scale of Philistine civilization, with massive fortifications, industrial quarters for olive oil and wine production, and imported ceramics that testify to extensive trade networks reaching across the Mediterranean, while the discovery of Aegean-style pottery and architectural elements suggests that the Philistines maintained cultural connections to their ancestral homelands in the eastern Mediterranean, even as they established themselves as the dominant power in Canaan. Into this complex geopolitical situation stepped David, whose early life as a shepherd in the Judean hills provided him with the skills that would later prove invaluable in warfare and leadership, including intimate knowledge of the region's topography, experience in protecting vulnerable charges from predators, and the kind of physical stamina and resourcefulness that comes from years of outdoor life in a challenging environment. The biblical account of David's anointing by the prophet Samuel at Bethlehem, while impossible to verify archaeologically, reflects the ancient Near Eastern practice of divine legitimation of rulers, a tradition documented in contemporary texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Hittite Empire, where kings regularly claimed divine selection and support as the basis for their authority, suggesting that even if the specific details of Samuel's visit cannot be confirmed, the underlying political and religious dynamics described in the narrative are consistent with broader regional patterns of royal ideology and succession practices. The famous encounter between David and Goliath, traditionally located in the Valley of Elah, takes on new significance when viewed against recent archaeological discoveries that have illuminated the military practices and technologies of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age periods, revealing that individual combat between champions was indeed a recognized form of warfare in the ancient Near East, documented in texts from Ugarit, Mari, and other contemporary civilizations, while the biblical description of Goliath's armor and weapons matches closely with archaeological examples of Philistine military equipment recovered from sites like Tel Miknekron and Tel Es Sophigath. The sling, David's weapon of choice in this legendary confrontation, was far from the primitive tool it might seem to modern readers, but rather a sophisticated projectile weapon capable of launching stones at velocities exceeding 100 miles per hour with remarkable accuracy, as demonstrated by experimental archaeology and confirmed by ancient military treatises from across the Mediterranean world, making David's victory over a heavily armored opponent not merely a triumph of faith over might, but a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated the young shepherd's understanding of how mobility and precision could overcome brute force and defensive technology. Following his victory over Goliath, David's entry into Saul's court represents a crucial phase in his development from rural warrior to political sophisticate, a transition that the biblical narrative presents as fraught with tension and complexity, reflecting the genuine challenges faced by any emerging leader seeking to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics, while maintaining the loyalty of both his original supporters and his new royal patrons. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Saul's reign, including his presumed capital at Gibeah, reveals a relatively modest level of royal infrastructure, with simple defensive works and limited signs of centralized administration, suggesting that Israel's first experiment with monarchy was still tentative and localized, lacking the sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus that would characterize David's later kingdom and providing context for understanding why Saul might have felt threatened by David's growing popularity and military success. The biblical account of David's time as an outlaw leader, gathering around himself a band of social outcasts and malcontents while evading Saul's increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate him, reflects a pattern of alternative power structures that emerged throughout the ancient Near East during periods of political instability, when traditional authority broke down and charismatic military leaders could attract followers by offering protection, booty, and the prospect of social advancement through successful raiding and conquest. Recent archaeological surveys in the Judean wilderness, where David is said to have hidden during his fugitive years, have revealed numerous caves and defensive positions that could have sheltered small groups of armed men, while the discovery of water sources and evidence of ancient settlement in seemingly inhospitable terrain demonstrates that the region could indeed support the kind of guerrilla warfare described in the biblical narrative, where intimate knowledge of local geography provided crucial tactical advantages over larger but less mobile conventional forces. David's complex relationship with the Philistines during this period, including his service as a vassal to Achish of Gath, illuminates the fluid nature of political allegiances in the ancient world, where pragmatic considerations of survival and advancement often trumped ethnic or religious loyalties, and where skilled warriors could find employment across cultural boundaries as long as they demonstrated competence and reliability in military affairs. The archaeological record from Philistine cities during this period shows evidence of increasing internal conflict and external pressure, suggesting that the Philistines themselves were struggling to maintain their dominance in the face of growing resistance from indigenous populations and possibly external threats from Egypt or other regional powers, creating opportunities for ambitious leaders like David to play different factions against each other while building their own power base through careful maneuvering and strategic alliance building. The death of Saul and Jonathan at the Battle of Mount Gilboa represents a watershed moment in Israel's history, creating the power vacuum that would allow David to emerge as the dominant figure in Israelite politics. But the biblical narrative makes clear that David's path to undisputed kingship was neither immediate nor inevitable, requiring 7 years of civil war and careful political maneuvering before he could unite the northern and southern tribes under his rule. Archaeological evidence from Hebron, where David established his first capital and ruled over Judah for 7 years, reveals a substantial Bronze Age and Iron Age settlement with impressive defensive walls and evidence of significant political and economic activity, confirming that the city possessed the infrastructure necessary to serve as a regional administrative center, and supporting the biblical claim that David chose his initial base of operations wisely, selecting a location that combined strategic defensibility with symbolic significance as the burial place of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The process by which David gradually extended his authority over the northern tribes, culminating in their recognition of his kingship at Hebron, reflects the complex dynamics of tribal politics in ancient Israel, where personal relationships, kinship networks, and demonstrated military competence all played crucial roles in legitimating political authority, and where the memory of past grievances and competing claims to leadership had to be carefully managed through a combination of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and selective use of force. David's decision to capture Jerusalem and establish it as his new capital represents one of the most consequential political moves in ancient history, transforming an obscure Jebusite hill town into the spiritual and administrative center of first the Israelite kingdom and later the Jewish people, while creating a neutral location that belonged to no particular tribe and could therefore serve as a unifying symbol for David's newly consolidated realm. Recent archaeological excavations in the city of David, the original core of ancient Jerusalem, have revealed evidence of significant construction activity during the Iron Age IIA period, traditionally associated with David's reign, including the remains of large stone structures that some scholars identify as David's palace or other royal buildings, though the interpretation of these finds remains hotly debated among archaeologists and biblical scholars who disagree about both the dating and the significance of the material remains. The discovery of the stepped stone structure, a massive retaining wall that supported major buildings on the eastern slope of the city of David, has been particularly significant in debates about the historical David, with some scholars arguing that its scale and sophistication demonstrate the existence of a substantial royal establishment in 10th century Jerusalem, while others contend that the structure could date to a later period or serve non-royal functions, illustrating the challenges involved in correlating archaeological evidence with specific historical events or personalities mentioned in ancient texts. Regardless of these ongoing scholarly debates, the archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates that Jerusalem underwent significant development during the early Iron Age, with new fortifications, residential areas, and public buildings that suggest the city was indeed becoming an important regional center during the period when David is traditionally said to have reigned, even if the precise nature and extent of this development remains subject to varying interpretations. The biblical account of David's organization of his kingdom provides fascinating insights into the administrative challenges faced by ancient rulers seeking to transform tribal confederations into centralized states, describing a complex bureaucracy that included military commanders, court officials, provincial governors, and religious functionaries, all working together to collect taxes, maintain order, dispense justice, and coordinate the various activities necessary for effective governance over a territorially extensive and ethnically diverse population. Archaeological parallels from other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, including the administrative archives from Mari, Nuzi, and Kanesh, demonstrate that the kind of bureaucratic apparatus described in connection with David's reign was indeed typical of successful monarchical states throughout the region, involving detailed record-keeping, standardized procedures for tax collection and military recruitment, and sophisticated systems for managing royal property and regulating trade relationships with neighboring powers. The biblical description of David's military organization, including his elite units of foreign mercenaries known as the Cherethites and Pelethites, reflects standard ancient Near Eastern practice of employing professional soldiers whose loyalty was tied directly to the king rather than to traditional tribal or clan structures, providing rulers with reliable military force that could be used to enforce royal authority even against domestic opposition, while the mention of specific commanders and their responsibilities suggests a level of military specialization that would have been necessary for conducting the kind of extensive campaigns attributed to David's reign. David's conquests of neighboring peoples, including the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, and Arameans, represented not merely territorial expansion but the creation of a tribute-paying empire that provided the economic foundation for the cultural and architectural achievements traditionally associated with the reigns of David and Solomon, while also establishing Israel as a significant regional power capable of competing with the established empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia for influence over the crucial trade routes connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. The archaeological evidence for David's military campaigns is necessarily limited, since ancient battles rarely leave distinctive material traces, but recent excavations at sites like Khirbet Kiafa, Tel Es Safi, and other locations associated with David's conflicts have revealed destruction layers and changes in material culture that could be consistent with military conquest and political reorganization during the 10th century BCE, though the interpretation of such evidence remains controversial and alternative explanations for the observed archaeological patterns cannot be definitively ruled out. The biblical narrative's emphasis on David's personal participation in military campaigns, including detailed accounts of siege warfare, battlefield tactics, and the treatment of conquered populations, reflects the ancient Near Eastern ideal of the warrior king, who led his troops personally and shared in the dangers and hardships of military life, an image that finds parallels in the royal inscriptions and artistic representations of contemporary rulers from Assyria, Egypt, and other regional powers who similarly emphasized their military prowess as a key component of royal legitimacy and divine favor. The establishment of Jerusalem as both political capital and religious center represents perhaps David's most enduring achievement, creating a unified focus for Israelite identity that would survive the destruction of the kingdom, the exile of its people, and the vicissitudes of foreign domination over many centuries, while also laying the foundation for Jerusalem's eventual significance in Christianity and Islam as well as Judaism. The biblical account of David's transportation of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem describes elaborate religious ceremonies that served not only to honor Israel's God, but also to demonstrate David's piety and legitimate authority as the divinely chosen king, employing ritual and spectacle to reinforce political messages in ways that were standard throughout the ancient Near East, where royal legitimacy was always intimately connected with claims of divine support and approval. Recent archaeological investigations of ancient Jerusalem have focused considerable attention on the location of the Temple Mount and its surroundings, seeking to understand the topographical and architectural context within which David's religious innovations took place. Though the complexity of the site's subsequent history, including multiple periods of destruction and reconstruction, makes it extremely difficult to identify remains that can be definitively associated with the 10th century BCE or with David's specific activities. The biblical description of David's plans for building a permanent temple to house the Ark, though ultimately realized by his son Solomon rather than David himself, reflects ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal patronage of religious institutions, where kings demonstrated their piety and secured divine favor by constructing and maintaining elaborate sanctuaries, often employing foreign craftsmen and materials to create buildings that would impress both domestic subjects and international visitors with their beauty and magnificence. The Psalms traditionally attributed to David, whether or not they were actually composed by the historical king, provide invaluable insights into the religious and cultural world of ancient Israel, expressing themes of divine kingship, personal relationship with God, military victory, and national destiny that resonated not only with David's contemporaries, but with countless subsequent generations of believers who found in these poems expressions of their own spiritual experiences and aspirations. The musical and poetic traditions associated with David's name suggest that the historical king was indeed a patron of the arts, if not an accomplished artist himself, continuing a long-standing tradition of royal cultural patronage that can be documented throughout the ancient Near East, where rulers regularly employed musicians, poets, and other creative professionals to enhance the prestige of their courts and create lasting monuments to their reigns in the form of literary and artistic works. David's complex family relationships, including his multiple marriages to women from different backgrounds and social classes, reflect both personal inclinations and calculated political strategies, designed to cement alliances with various groups within and outside his kingdom, following patterns of royal marriage diplomacy that were standard throughout the ancient world, where matrimonial connections served as crucial instruments of statecraft and international relations. The biblical narrative's frank treatment of David's domestic troubles, including the rebellion of his son Absalom and the succession crisis that marked the end of his reign, provides a remarkably realistic portrait of the challenges faced by ancient monarchs in managing not only external threats but also internal family dynamics that could threaten dynastic stability and political continuity. Archaeological evidence for the material culture of David's court remains limited, but comparative studies of contemporary royal establishments throughout the ancient Near East suggest that David's palace would have been furnished with imported luxury goods, including ivory carvings, precious metals, fine textiles, and exotic foods and spices that demonstrated the king's wealth and international connections while providing suitable settings for the diplomatic receptions and ceremonial occasions that were essential components of ancient royal life. The biblical account of David's census of Israel, which provoked divine displeasure and led to a plague that was ended only by David's purchase of a threshing floor from Araunah the Jebusite, illustrates the complex relationship between royal authority and divine approval that characterized ancient Near Eastern kingship, where rulers were expected to respect traditional limits on their power while also exercising the kind of administrative control necessary for effective governance of complex societies. The The site traditionally identified as Araunah's threshing floor, located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, would later become the location of Solomon's Temple and remains today one of the most contested and significant religious sites in the world, testifying to the enduring significance of decisions made during David's reign, and their continuing impact on contemporary political and religious conflicts. David's establishment of a professional bureaucracy, including scribes, administrators, and judicial officials who were responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of his kingdom, represented a crucial step in the evolution of Israelite society from tribal organization to monarchical state, creating institutional structures that would survive subsequent political crises and provide continuity across changes of dynasty and even foreign conquest. The archaeological evidence for literacy and administrative record-keeping in Iron Age Israel, including the discovery of seals, inscriptions, and other written materials from sites throughout the region, suggests that David's kingdom did indeed develop the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure described in biblical accounts, though the extent and sophistication of these systems remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate and investigation. The military innovations attributed to David's reign reflect broader technological and tactical developments that were transforming warfare throughout the ancient Near East during the early Iron Age, as the introduction of iron weapons, improvements in siege warfare techniques, and the development of professional military units created new opportunities for ambitious rulers to expand their territories and establish regional hegemonies. The biblical descriptions of David's military organization, including his personal bodyguard of foreign mercenaries, his elite units of veteran warriors, and his systematic approach to recruitment and training, parallel developments in other contemporary kingdoms where successful rulers were learning to combine traditional tribal military practices with more sophisticated professional army structures derived from international military technology and doctrine. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with David's military campaigns, while often ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations, does suggest patterns of destruction and reconstruction that could be consistent with the kind of extensive warfare described in biblical accounts, particularly in regions like the Shephelah where Israeli and Philistine territories came into contact, and where recent excavations have revealed evidence of significant military activity during the 10th century BCE. The economic foundations of David's kingdom, based on the biblical account, included not only traditional agricultural production and pastoralism, but also tribute from conquered peoples, proceeds from international trade, and revenues from the development of natural resources including copper mining in the Araba Valley south of the Dead Sea, creating a diversified economic base that could support both military expansion and the cultural achievements traditionally associated with David's reign, and that of his successor Solomon. Recent archaeological investigations of Iron Age copper production sites in the Araba, particularly at Khirbet Enehas and other locations in the region, have revealed evidence of large-scale mining and smelting operations that could have been connected with the economic activities of David's kingdom, though the dating and political attribution of these remains continues to be debated among scholars who disagree about both the chronology and the historical significance of the material. Evidence. The biblical account of David's diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers, including his friendship with Hiram of Tyre and his various military and political dealings with Egypt, Aram, and other regional states, reflects the complex international environment of the early Iron Age, when the collapse of Bronze Age empires had created opportunities for new political entities to emerge, while also requiring skilled diplomacy to navigate the competing interests and power struggles that characterized the period. David's reputation as a military strategist and tactical innovator, preserved not only in biblical accounts but also in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, suggests that contemporaries recognized him as possessing exceptional abilities in warfare and statecraft, capabilities that would have been essential for anyone seeking to unite the fractious Israelite tribes and establish a kingdom capable of competing with established regional powers. The archaeological evidence for David's building projects, while limited and often disputed, includes remains of fortification systems, administrative buildings, and other infrastructure projects that could be consistent with the kind of construction activity described in connection with the establishment and consolidation of the Israelite kingdom, though scholars continue to debate both the dating and the attribution of many of these remains. The biblical narrative's treatment of David's religious policies, including his efforts to centralize worship in Jerusalem and his patronage of the priestly establishment, reflects broader ancient Near Eastern patterns of royal religious activity, where successful kings were expected to demonstrate their piety and secure divine support through temple construction, ritual observance, and support for religious functionaries, while also using religious institutions to reinforce political authority and social cohesion. David's complex relationship with the prophet Nathan, who served both as royal advisor and as divine spokesman authorized to criticize royal policies when they conflicted with religious law and traditional moral standards, illustrates the tension between political expediency and religious obligation that characterized ancient Near Eastern kingship, where rulers had to balance the practical requirements of governance with the need to maintain their legitimacy as divinely appointed leaders. The famous parable of the poor man's lamb, used by Nathan to confront David about his adultery with Bathsheba and his arrangement of her husband Uriah's death in battle, demonstrates both the moral courage of Israel's prophetic tradition and the willingness of at least some ancient Near Eastern kings to acknowledge their fallibility and accept criticism from religious authorities, though the extent to which such episodes represent typical rather than exceptional behavior remains difficult to determine from the available evidence. The Bathsheba incident and its aftermath, including the death of David's infant son and the subsequent birth of Solomon, who would become David's successor, illustrates the complex interplay between personal conduct, divine judgment, and political consequences that the biblical narrative presents as characteristic of David's reign, while also providing insights into ancient Near Eastern attitudes toward royal sexuality, marriage, and succession that can be compared with similar themes in the literature and legal traditions of other contemporary cultures. The rebellion of Absalom represents one of the most dramatic and psychologically complex episodes in the David narrative, revealing the personal costs of political power and the ways in which family dynamics could threaten even the most successful ancient kingdoms, while also demonstrating David's remarkable ability to recover from devastating setbacks through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and personal charisma that won back the loyalty of subjects who had initially supported his son's coup attempt. The biblical account of Absalom's rebellion provides valuable insights into ancient Near Eastern political culture, including the importance of public appearance and popular support in legitimating royal authority, the role of kinship networks in organizing political opposition, and the ways in which regional and tribal rivalries could be exploited by rival claimants to the throne, all themes that find parallels in the political literature and historical records of other contemporary civilizations. Archaeological evidence related to the rebellion is necessarily limited, since the events described involved primarily movement of armies and political maneuvering rather than major construction projects or long-term settlement changes. But recent studies of the topography and road systems of ancient Palestine have helped clarify the geographic context of David's flight from Jerusalem and his eventual return to power, confirming the strategic importance of locations mentioned in the biblical narrative and supporting the general plausibility of the account. The psychological portrait of David presented in the biblical narrative during and after Absalom's rebellion reveals a complex figure struggling with guilt over his treatment of his family, grief over the loss of his son, and the practical challenges of restoring political stability after a devastating civil war, while also demonstrating the personal qualities of resilience, pragmatism, and leadership that had originally enabled him to rise from shepherd boy to king of Israel. David's handling of the aftermath of Absalom's rebellion, including his pardoning of former enemies, his reorganization of his administration, and his efforts to reconcile the competing factions within his kingdom, illustrates both his political sophistication and his understanding of the necessity for magnanimity and reconciliation in the aftermath of civil conflict, principles that would be recognized and celebrated by later political theorists and historians as essential components of successful statecraft. The succession crisis that marked the end of David's reign, involving the competing claims of Adonijah and Solomon and ultimately resolved through the intervention of Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, demonstrates the continuing importance of religious legitimation in ancient Near Eastern politics, while also revealing the complex dynamics of court intrigue and dynastic succession that characterized monarchical government throughout the region. The archaeological evidence for the transition from David's reign to that of Solomon is reflected primarily in changes in material culture and construction activity that suggest increasing centralization of authority and expansion of royal building projects, though the attribution of specific remains to particular kings continues to be debated among scholars who disagree about both chronological and political questions related to the archaeological record of Iron Age Israel. David's final years, as portrayed in the biblical narrative, present a picture of an aging monarch struggling with physical decline while still attempting to manage the complex political and family relationships that had defined his career, ultimately succeeding in ensuring a relatively peaceful succession despite the various challenges and conspiracies that threatened dynastic continuity. The biblical account of David's final instructions to Solomon, emphasizing both the practical requirements of successful kingship and the moral and religious obligations that came with royal authority, reflects ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal wisdom literature, while also providing insights into David's own understanding of the lessons learned during his long and eventful reign. The death and burial of David, described in biblical accounts as occurring after a reign of 40 years divided between 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem, marked the end of one of the most significant reigns in ancient Near Eastern history and the beginning of a period of even greater prosperity and international prominence under his son Solomon, though it also initiated a process of gradual decline that would eventually lead to the division of the kingdom and the loss of the political independence that David had worked so hard to establish and maintain. The archaeological evidence for David's tomb, traditionally located in the city of David in Jerusalem, remains inconclusive despite centuries of investigation and speculation, reflecting both the difficulty of identifying specific burial sites from the Iron Age and the extent to which later religious and political developments have complicated efforts to understand the material remains of David's period through scientific excavation and analysis. The religious and cultural legacy of David extends far beyond his political achievements, encompassing contributions to music, poetry, and spiritual life that would influence not only Judaism but also Christianity and Islam, making him one of the few ancient figures whose significance transcends the boundaries of any single religious or cultural tradition. The Psalms attributed to David, numbering 73 in the traditional Hebrew canon, represent some of the most influential religious poetry in world literature, expressing themes of praise, lament, petition, and thanksgiving that have provided models for religious expression across cultures and centuries, while also preserving glimpses of the religious and emotional world of ancient Israel that complement and sometimes complicate the historical narratives found elsewhere in biblical literature. The musical traditions associated with David's name, including his reputation as a skilled harpist and innovator in temple worship, reflect the important role that music played in ancient Near Eastern religious and court life, while also establishing precedents for the integration of musical performance with religious observance that would become central features of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic worship practices. Archaeological evidence for musical instruments and religious practices in Iron Age Israel, including the discovery of various types of lyres, drums, and wind instruments at sites throughout the region, confirms that music was indeed an important component of ancient Israelite culture and supports the biblical portrayal of David as a patron and practitioner of musical arts, though the specific attribution of particular innovations or compositions to the historical David remains impossible to verify through material evidence alone. The theological significance of David in Jewish tradition extends beyond his historical achievements to encompass his role as the archetypal ideal king, the standard against which all subsequent rulers would be measured and the model for the expected messianic deliverer who would restore Israel's independence and establish divine justice on earth, themes that would profoundly influence Jewish thought and expectation throughout the subsequent centuries of foreign domination and political dispersion. The Christian appropriation of Davidic imagery and expectations, particularly the identification of Jesus as the son of David and the fulfillment of messianic prophecies connected with the Davidic line, demonstrates the continuing power of David's legacy to shape religious imagination and theological reflection long after the historical kingdom had disappeared, while also illustrating the ways in which ancient political and religious traditions could be reinterpreted and transformed to meet the needs of new historical circumstances and religious communities. Islamic traditions regarding David, known in Arabic as Dawood, emphasize his role as a prophet and righteous ruler who received divine revelation and served as a model of piety and justice for subsequent generations, while also acknowledging his human fallibility and the moral lessons to be derived from both his successes and his failures, themes that parallel but also differ in significant ways from Jewish and Christian interpretations of David's significance and meaning. The archaeological quest for the historical David continues to generate intense scholarly interest and public attention, with new discoveries and interpretations regularly challenging or supporting various aspects of the traditional biblical narrative, while also revealing the complexity of ancient Near Eastern society and the difficulty of correlating textual sources with material remains in ways that satisfy both scientific standards and religious sensibilities. Recent developments in archaeological methodology, including improved dating techniques, environmental analysis, and comparative studies of material culture across the ancient Near East, have provided new tools for investigating David's period, while also highlighting the limitations of archaeological evidence and the need for careful interpretation that takes into account both the possibilities and the constraints inherent in material remains from such ancient periods. The ongoing political significance of David's legacy, particularly in contemporary debates over Jerusalem and the land of Israel, demonstrates the continuing power of ancient traditions to influence modern political discourse and international relations, while also illustrating the ways in which historical and archaeological research can become entangled with contemporary political agendas and religious commitments that may compromise scientific objectivity and scholarly independence. The literary and artistic legacy of David, reflected in countless works of music, visual art, drama, and fiction that have drawn inspiration from his story across many centuries and cultures, testifies to the enduring power of his narrative to capture human imagination and provide symbols and metaphors for understanding the complexities of leadership, faith, moral struggle, and the relationship between divine will and human ambition that characterize the human condition in all times and places. The international context of David's reign becomes clearer when viewed against the broader political and economic developments that were transforming the ancient Near East during the early Iron Age, as the collapse of the great Bronze Age empires created opportunities for new political entities to emerge, while also generating instability and conflict that required skilled leadership and diplomatic acumen to navigate successfully. The decline of Egyptian power in Canaan, evidenced by archaeological remains showing reduced Egyptian presence and influence at sites throughout Palestine during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, created a power vacuum that ambitious local rulers like David could exploit to establish independent kingdoms, while the temporary weakness of Mesopotamian empires provided additional opportunities for regional autonomy and territorial expansion that would not have been possible during periods of stronger imperial control. The rise of the Aramean kingdoms in Syria, evidenced by archaeological remains and textual sources from sites like Damascus, Hamath, and other regional centers, created both challenges and opportunities for David's kingdom, as these new political entities competed for control over trade routes and territory, while also providing potential allies or enemies, depending on the shifting balance of regional power and the success of various diplomatic and military initiatives. The Philistine cities continued to represent significant challenges to Israelite expansion and independence throughout David's reign, as evidenced by archaeological remains showing continued Philistine cultural distinctiveness and political autonomy at sites like Ekron, Gath, and Ashkelon, though the biblical narrative suggests that David was ultimately successful in reducing Philistine power and establishing Israelite hegemony over much of the territory that had previously been contested. Between the two peoples, the archaeological evidence for international trade and cultural exchange during David's period, including the discovery of imported pottery, metalwork, and other luxury goods at sites throughout Palestine, demonstrates that the region was indeed connected to broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern economic networks, supporting biblical claims about the prosperity and international connections of David's kingdom, while also providing context for understanding how a relatively small territorial state could accumulate the wealth and resources necessary to support ambitious military and construction projects. The emergence of Phoenician maritime power during this period, evidenced by archaeological remains showing expanded Phoenician settlement and trade activity throughout the Mediterranean, created new opportunities for mutually beneficial relationships between land-based kingdoms like David's and sea-oriented commercial powers like Tyre and Sidon, relationships that are reflected in biblical accounts of diplomatic and economic cooperation between David and Hiram of Tyre. The continuing presence of Egypt as a regional power, despite its reduced direct involvement in Canaanite affairs, provided both opportunities and constraints for David's kingdom, as Egyptian support or opposition could significantly influence the success or failure of military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives, while Egyptian cultural and technological influence continued to affect developments in art, architecture, and administrative practices throughout the region. The archaeological evidence for military technology and fortification systems during David's period reveals significant innovations in siege warfare, defensive architecture, and weapons manufacture that reflect both local technological development and the influence of international military practices, supporting biblical accounts of David's military successes, while also providing context for understanding how relatively small kingdoms could challenge and defeat more established powers through superior tactics, leadership, and technological adaptation. The development of writing systems and administrative record-keeping during the Iron Age, evidenced by the discovery of inscriptions, seals, and other written materials at sites throughout the ancient Near East, created new possibilities for centralized government and bureaucratic administration that rulers like David could exploit to create more effective and durable political institutions than had been possible during earlier periods when oral tradition and personal relationships provided the primary mechanisms for political organization and social control. The religious and cultural innovations associated with David's reign, including the centralization of worship in Jerusalem and the development of new forms of religious expression and artistic creation, reflected broader regional trends toward religious synthesis and cultural creativity. Creativity that characterized the early Iron Age throughout the ancient Near East, as the collapse of older political and religious systems created opportunities for new forms of spiritual and artistic expression, while also generating anxiety and uncertainty that drove people to seek new sources of meaning and identity. The economic foundations of David's kingdom, according to biblical and archaeological evidence, encompassed a diverse range of activities and resources that enabled the political and military expansion traditionally associated with his reign, while also creating the material basis for the cultural and architectural achievements that would be fully realized under his successor Solomon. Agricultural production remained the fundamental basis of the kingdom's economy, with the fertile valleys and hillsides of Palestine providing grain, wine, and oil that sustained both the local population and the expanded military and administrative apparatus that David's conquests required, while archaeological evidence from Iron Age agricultural sites throughout the region demonstrates the sophisticated farming techniques and crop storage systems that made possible the kind of agricultural surplus necessary to support non-productive specialists in military, religious, and administrative roles. Pastoralism continued to play an important role in the kingdom's economy, particularly in the marginal lands south and east of the settled agricultural areas, where sheep and goat herding provided not only meat, milk, and wool for domestic consumption but also animals for sacrifice, trade goods for international commerce, and a mobile economic resource that could be moved quickly in response to military or political necessities, while David's own background as a shepherd would have given him intimate familiarity with pastoral practices and their economic significance. The control of trade routes represented a crucial source of revenue for David's kingdom, as the location of Palestine at the crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe made it a natural corridor for international commerce, while the establishment of political stability and military security under David's rule would have encouraged merchant caravans and trading expeditions that generated customs revenues, provided markets for local products, and brought foreign goods and technologies that enhanced both the material prosperity and the cultural sophistication of the kingdom. Archaeological evidence for copper mining and metallurgical production in the Araba Valley south of the Dead Sea, while sometimes attributed to later periods, may reflect economic activities that began during David's reign and contributed to the kingdom's wealth and military capabilities, as control over metal production would have provided both trade goods for international commerce and raw materials for weapons and tools that enhanced agricultural productivity and military effectiveness. The tribute payments from conquered peoples, described in biblical accounts as a major source of royal revenue, would have included not only precious metals and luxury goods but also agricultural products, livestock, crafted goods, and human resources in the form of skilled artisans and laborers who could contribute to royal building projects and military campaigns, creating a diversified income stream that reduced the kingdom's dependence on any single economic sector, while also providing the resources necessary for territorial expansion and political consolidation. The development of specialized crafts and industries during David's reign, evidenced by archaeological remains of workshops, tools, and finished products from sites throughout Iron Age Palestine, reflects the kind of economic diversification and technological advancement that typically accompanies successful political centralization, as royal patronage and protection encouraged artisans and merchants to develop new techniques and products while expanding markets provided incentives for increased production and innovation in fields ranging from metallurgy and textile production to ceramic manufacture and jewelry making. The biblical accounts of David's administrative organization suggest the development of a sophisticated system for collecting and managing royal revenues, including appointed officials responsible for various aspects of the kingdom's economy, standardized procedures for tax collection and tribute assessment, and centralized storage facilities for accumulating and distributing the agricultural surpluses and trade goods that provided the material foundation for royal power. While archaeological evidence for storage installations, administrative seals, and other bureaucratic apparatus at sites like Jerusalem and other administrative centers supports the general plausibility of these accounts, even if specific details cannot be verified through material remains alone. The integration of formerly independent territories into David's economic system would have required careful attention to local traditions and practices, as successful imperial administration typically involves balancing centralized control with respect for regional autonomy, and the biblical narrative suggests that David was generally successful in maintaining the loyalty of conquered peoples through a combination of firm military control and flexible administrative policies that allowed local elites to maintain their status and privileges as long as they remained loyal to the central government and met their obligations for tribute and military service. The archaeological evidence for urbanization and settlement expansion during the Iron Age IIA period, traditionally associated with David's reign, indicates significant population growth and economic development that would have provided both the human resources and the material foundation necessary for the kind of territorial expansion and political consolidation described in biblical accounts, while also creating the internal markets and production centers that could sustain a more complex and centralized political system than had previously existed in the region. The relationship between economic prosperity and military success in David's kingdom illustrates the mutually reinforcing nature of political expansion and material development in ancient societies, where military conquests provided the resources necessary for further expansion while economic growth provided the foundation for maintaining larger and more effective military forces, creating a cycle of expansion and consolidation that could continue as long as external conditions remained favorable and internal political stability could be maintained. The biblical emphasis on David's personal involvement in economic planning and resource management, including his oversight of royal properties, his attention to trade relationships, and his concern for ensuring adequate supplies for military campaigns, reflects the hands-on approach to governance that was typical of successful ancient rulers, who could not rely on elaborate bureaucratic systems but had to maintain personal control over the key decisions and relationships that determined their kingdom's prosperity and security. The archaeological evidence for technological innovation during David's period, including improvements in agricultural techniques, advances in metallurgy and crafts production, and the development of new forms of military equipment and fortification systems, suggests that the political stability and economic prosperity associated with David's reign created conditions favorable to technological advancement and cultural development, as the availability of resources and the demand for improved products encouraged experimentation and innovation across a wide range of fields. The international economic relationships that David's kingdom maintained with neighboring powers, evidenced both by biblical accounts and by archaeological remains showing cultural exchange and trade connections, demonstrate the extent to which even successful ancient kingdoms remained dependent on external sources of raw materials, luxury goods, and technological knowledge, while also providing markets for their own products and services that could generate the revenues necessary to support expanded political ambitions and military activities. The religious innovations and institutional developments associated with David's reign represent some of his most lasting and influential achievements, creating the theological and liturgical foundations that would shape not only Judaism but also the subsequent development of Christianity and Islam, while also demonstrating the crucial role that religious legitimation played in ancient Near Eastern politics and the sophisticated understanding of symbolic communication that characterized successful ancient rulers. The transportation of the Ark of the Covenant from its temporary resting place to Jerusalem represents far more than a simple relocation of a sacred object, but rather a carefully orchestrated political and religious event designed to demonstrate David's piety, establish Jerusalem's significance as a religious center, and create a powerful symbol of national unity that could help integrate the diverse tribal and regional groups that comprised his expanding kingdom, while also providing a visible manifestation of divine approval for David's rule that could counter potential challenges to his authority from traditional religious and political leaders. The elaborate ceremonies and celebrations that accompanied the ark's arrival in Jerusalem, described in biblical accounts with remarkable attention to detail regarding music, dance, sacrificial offerings, and public participation, reflect ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal religious spectacle that served multiple purposes including entertainment, education, political propaganda, and genuine religious expression, while also demonstrating David's understanding of the importance of popular participation and emotional engagement in creating lasting political and religious loyalty. The establishment of a permanent religious establishment in Jerusalem, including priests, musicians, and other religious functionaries whose duties were carefully defined and whose activities were coordinated with the broader administrative and military apparatus of the kingdom, represents a significant innovation in Israelite religious practice that would have profound implications for the development of Jewish theology and worship, while also providing David with a powerful institutional tool for maintaining social cohesion and political legitimacy throughout his territorially extensive and ethnically diverse realm. The biblical accounts of David's plans for building a permanent temple to house the ark, though ultimately realized by Solomon rather than David himself, reflect the standard ancient Near Eastern practice of royal religious patronage and the understanding that monumental religious architecture served not only spiritual purposes but also political and diplomatic functions by demonstrating royal wealth, piety, and divine approval to both domestic subjects and foreign visitors who might be impressed by the scale and magnificence of royal building projects. The development of new forms of religious music and poetry during David's reign, evidenced both by biblical attributions of specific psalms to David and by the broader tradition of Davidic psalmic composition that would continue long after his death, represents a crucial innovation in Israelite religious culture that provided models for personal and communal religious expression while also creating literary and musical traditions that would influence religious practice and theological reflection for millennia to come. The integration of religious and political authority in David's person, reflected in his roles as both king and religious leader, follows ancient Near Eastern patterns of sacred kingship while also creating distinctively Israelite traditions regarding the relationship between divine authority and human governance that would profoundly influence subsequent Jewish, Christian, and Islamic political theology and continue to affect contemporary debates about the proper relationship between religious and secular authority in modern societies. The prophetic tradition's development during David's reign, particularly the emergence of figures like Nathan who combined roles as royal advisors and divine spokesmen, authorized to criticize royal policies when they conflicted with religious law and moral standards, represents a significant innovation in ancient political culture that provided institutional mechanisms for limiting royal power and holding rulers accountable to higher standards of justice and righteousness, while also creating precedents for religious criticism of political authority that would continue to influence Western political thought and practice. The archaeological evidence for religious practices during David's period, while necessarily limited due to the perishable nature of many ritual objects and the subsequent history of destruction and reconstruction at religious sites, does include discoveries of cult objects, religious inscriptions, and architectural remains that suggest the kind of religious innovation and institutional development described in biblical accounts, though the interpretation of such material remains continues to be debated among scholars who disagree about both their dating and their significance for understanding ancient Israelite religion. The theological implications of David's religious policies, particularly his efforts to centralize worship in Jerusalem and his establishment of new forms of religious expression that emphasized personal relationship with God alongside traditional communal and ritual observances, would have profound consequences for the development of monotheistic religion and continue to influence contemporary religious thought and practice, while also demonstrating the extent to which individual rulers could shape and redirect religious traditions through their personal vision and institutional innovations. The international religious and cultural exchanges that characterized David's reign, evidenced by biblical accounts of diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers and by archaeological remains showing cultural influence and technological transfer across political boundaries, illustrate the extent to which religious innovation in ancient societies typically involved creative synthesis of diverse traditions rather than simple preservation of inherited practices, while also demonstrating how successful political leaders could use religious and cultural policies to enhance their kingdom's international prestige and diplomatic effectiveness. The military organization and tactical innovations that characterize David's reign represent crucial developments in ancient Near Eastern warfare that would influence military practice throughout the region, while also providing the foundation for the territorial expansion and political consolidation that made possible the cultural and economic achievements traditionally associated with the Golden Age of ancient Israel. The biblical descriptions of David's military forces reveal a sophisticated understanding of the different types of combat units and their appropriate uses, including heavy infantry equipped with traditional weapons and armor for conventional battlefield engagements, light infantry skilled in guerrilla warfare and reconnaissance activities, cavalry and chariot forces for rapid movement and shock action, and specialized siege engineers capable of reducing fortified cities through a combination of technical expertise and sustained operational planning that could overcome even the most formidable defensive installations. The integration of foreign mercenary units into David's military organization, particularly the Cherethites and Pelethites who served as his personal bodyguard and elite strike force, reflects both the international character of ancient warfare and David's pragmatic recognition that military effectiveness often required recruiting skilled professionals whose loyalty was based on material rewards and personal relationships rather than traditional tribal or ethnic allegiances, while also providing him with reliable military resources that could be used against domestic opposition as well as foreign enemies. The archaeological evidence for military technology during David's period, including discoveries of weapons, armor, and fortification systems at sites throughout Palestine, demonstrates significant innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and tactical doctrine that would have enhanced the effectiveness of organized military forces while also requiring increased economic resources and administrative coordination to produce, maintain, and deploy effectively in extended campaigns against well-equipped and determined opponents. The biblical accounts of David's siege warfare techniques, including his successful reduction of Jerusalem and other fortified cities, reflect sophisticated understanding of the engineering and logistical challenges involved in capturing defended positions, while also demonstrating the kind of sustained operational planning and resource mobilization that would have been necessary to maintain effective military pressure against enemies who could rely on defensive advantages and external support. To resist Israelite expansion, the development of intelligence networks and reconnaissance capabilities under David's leadership, evidenced by biblical accounts of spies, scouts, and informants who provided crucial information about enemy movements and capabilities, illustrates the extent to which ancient warfare required not only battlefield courage and tactical skill but also strategic intelligence and operational security that could provide decisive advantages in planning and executing military campaigns against opponents who possessed their own sources of information and strategic planning capabilities. The coordination between military and diplomatic activities during David's reign, including the use of military pressure to support diplomatic negotiations and the employment of diplomatic initiatives to isolate enemies and secure allies before beginning major military campaigns, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the relationship between warfare and statecraft that enabled relatively small kingdoms to achieve disproportionate influence and territorial control through skillful manipulation of regional power balances and alliance systems. The logistical innovations that made possible David's extended military campaigns, including systems for supplying armies in the field, coordinating movements across difficult terrain, and maintaining communications between dispersed forces operating over wide geographical areas, would have required administrative capabilities and resource mobilization on a scale that previously had not existed in Israelite society, while also providing organizational models and institutional precedents that would influence subsequent military and administrative development throughout the ancient Near East. The psychological and cultural dimensions of David's military leadership, including his personal participation in combat, his attention to the welfare and morale of his troops, and his skillful use of religious symbolism and ritual to motivate military performance and maintain unit cohesion, reflect ancient Near Eastern traditions of warrior kingship, while also demonstrating the charismatic qualities that enabled him to inspire extraordinary loyalty and dedication among followers who were willing to endure severe hardships and face formidable dangers in pursuit of his strategic objectives. The integration of conquered populations into David's military system, through a combination of voluntary recruitment, compulsory service, and the incorporation of existing military units under new command structures, illustrates both the challenges and opportunities involved in imperial expansion, as successful conquest required not only initial military victory but also sustained efforts to transform former enemies into loyal subjects whose military capabilities could be redirected toward supporting rather than opposing the central government. The archaeological evidence for military installations and defensive systems during David's period, including fortified cities, garrison posts, and strategic road networks that facilitated rapid military movement and communication across the kingdom's expanding territories, supports biblical accounts of systematic military organization while also demonstrating the extent to which successful ancient rulers had to invest significant resources in military infrastructure and defensive preparations that could protect their achievements against both external threats and internal rebellions. The artistic and cultural achievements of David's reign, while often overshadowed by the more spectacular accomplishments attributed to Solomon's period, nevertheless represent crucial developments in Israelite civilization that would provide the foundation for later cultural flowering, while also demonstrating the extent to which political stability and economic prosperity could create conditions favorable to creative expression and intellectual development. The musical innovations associated with David's name, including both his personal reputation as a skilled performer and his institutional support for the development of temple music and religious poetry, reflect the important role that artistic patronage played in ancient royal courts, while also creating traditions of religious and secular music that would influence cultural development throughout the ancient Near East and continue to affect contemporary musical and poetic expression in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic communities around the world. The literary achievements of David's period, evidenced both by the Psalmic poetry attributed to his authorship and by the sophisticated narrative techniques employed in biblical accounts of his reign, demonstrate remarkable advances in Hebrew literary culture that would provide models and inspiration for subsequent generations of writers, poets, and religious thinkers, while also preserving invaluable records of ancient Israelite society, politics, and religious belief that continue to influence contemporary scholarship and cultural understanding. The architectural developments that began during David's reign, though more fully realized under Solomon, included not only the planning and preparation for major construction projects like the Jerusalem Temple, but also the development of new building techniques, the training of skilled craftsmen, and the establishment of international relationships with suppliers of materials and technical expertise that would make possible the monumental achievements traditionally associated with the Golden Age of ancient Israel. The archaeological evidence for artistic production during David's period, while necessarily limited due to the perishable nature of many ancient art forms and the subsequent history of destruction and reconstruction at major sites, does include discoveries of decorative objects, religious artifacts, and architectural elements that suggest significant development in craftsmanship and aesthetic sophistication, though the interpretation of such material remains continues to be debated among scholars who disagree about both their dating and their cultural significance. The international cultural exchanges that characterized David's reign, evidenced by biblical accounts of diplomatic relationships and by archaeological remains showing foreign influence in local material culture, demonstrate the extent to which artistic and intellectual development in ancient societies typically involved creative synthesis of diverse traditions rather than isolated indigenous development, while also illustrating how successful political leaders could use cultural policies to enhance their kingdom's international prestige and create lasting monuments to their achievements. The development of educational institutions and intellectual traditions during David's reign, though not extensively documented in surviving sources, would have been necessary to support the administrative, military, and religious innovations that characterize his period, requiring the training of scribes, the preservation and transmission of legal and religious traditions, and the development of new forms of knowledge and expertise that could support the complex demands of governing an expanded and diversified kingdom. The integration of religious and secular cultural expression during David's reign, reflected in the development of Psalmic poetry, that combined personal spiritual experience with political themes and communal religious concerns, represents a significant innovation in ancient literature that would influence not only subsequent Jewish religious culture, but also Christian and Islamic traditions of religious poetry and musical expression that continue to affect contemporary spiritual and artistic life. The preservation and transmission of cultural traditions during David's reign, including both the maintenance of ancient Israelite customs and the creative adaptation of foreign influences and new historical circumstances, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cultural continuity and innovation that enabled ancient societies to maintain their distinctive identity, while also adapting to changing political and economic conditions that required new forms of expression and institutional organization. The legacy of David's cultural achievements, reflected in the continuing influence of Psalmic poetry, the enduring significance of Jerusalem as a cultural and religious center, and the persistent appeal of Davidic imagery and symbolism in subsequent Jewish, Christian, and Islamic art and literature, testifies to the extent to which individual rulers could create lasting cultural innovations that would continue to influence human civilization long after their political achievements had been forgotten or superseded by subsequent historical developments. The relationship between cultural achievement and political power during David's reign illustrates the extent to which artistic and intellectual development in ancient societies typically required royal patronage and political stability, while also demonstrating how cultural innovations could reinforce and legitimize political authority by creating powerful symbols and traditions that enhanced popular loyalty and international prestige in ways that purely military or economic achievements could not accomplish. The final years of David's reign were marked by a series of personal and political crises that tested both his leadership abilities and the stability of the kingdom he had spent decades building, while also providing crucial insights into the challenges faced by aging rulers in ancient societies where political succession often involved violent competition between rival claimants and where the personal qualities that had originally enabled successful leaders to achieve power might not always prove adequate for managing the complex problems that arose during extended periods of rule. The rebellion of Absalom represents perhaps the most traumatic and revealing episode of David's later years, demonstrating both the personal costs of political ambition and the ways in which family relationships could become entangled with broader political dynamics in ways that threatened not only individual rulers but also the stability and continuity of the political systems they had worked to create and maintain. The biblical account of Absalom's rebellion provides remarkable psychological insights into the dynamics of father-son relationships under the pressures of royal succession, while also illustrating the broader political tensions that could arise when traditional tribal and regional loyalties conflicted with the centralizing tendencies of monarchical government, and when personal grievances and family conflicts became symbols for larger social and political dissatisfactions. The geographical scope and popular support that Absalom's rebellion initially attracted, according to biblical accounts, suggests that David's kingdom faced significant internal tensions and unresolved conflicts that ambitious rivals could exploit, while also demonstrating the extent to which successful ancient rulers had to maintain not only military superiority, but also popular legitimacy and personal charisma that could inspire loyalty even during periods of crisis and uncertainty. The military campaigns that ultimately defeated Absalom's rebellion reveal David's continuing strategic abilities and his capacity to recover from devastating setbacks through a combination of tactical skill, political acumen, and personal relationships that enabled him to rally support and organize effective resistance, even when his position appeared hopeless and his enemies seemed to have gained decisive advantages through superior numbers and initial strategic successes. The aftermath of Absalom's rebellion, including David's grief over his son's death and his efforts to reconcile with former supporters who had joined the revolt, illustrates both his personal humanity and his political sophistication, as he recognized the necessity of forgiveness and reconciliation in restoring political stability, while also struggling with the emotional costs of the conflict and the complex moral questions raised by civil war and family violence. The succession crisis that developed during David's final years, involving competition between Adonijah and Solomon, and ultimately resolved through the intervention of Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, demonstrates the continuing importance of religious legitimation in ancient Near Eastern politics, while also revealing the complex dynamics of court intrigue and the ways in which different factions within the royal establishment could compete for influence over crucial political decisions. The archaeological evidence for the transition from David's reign to that of Solomon, while necessarily limited and subject to various interpretations, does suggest continuity in material culture and construction activity that supports biblical accounts of relatively peaceful succession despite the various political tensions and conspiracies that surrounded the change of rulers, while also indicating the institutional stability and administrative continuity that David's governmental innovations had created. The biblical account of David's final instructions to Solomon, emphasizing both practical political advice and moral and religious guidance, reflects ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal wisdom literature while also providing insights into David's own understanding of the lessons he had learned during his long and eventful career as both warrior and king, ruler and father, strategic planner and religious innovator. The death of David, described as occurring peacefully in Jerusalem after a reign of 40 years, marked the end of one of the most significant periods in ancient Near Eastern history and the beginning of a new phase in Israelite political development that would see both the greatest achievements and the ultimate decline of the United Kingdom that David had created through his military conquests, diplomatic initiatives, and institutional innovations. The immediate aftermath of David's death, including the consolidation of Solomon's authority and the elimination of potential rivals, demonstrates both the effectiveness of the succession arrangements that David had established and the continuing challenges involved in maintaining political stability in ancient monarchical systems where personal relationships and family dynamics could have profound implications for governmental continuity and social order. The assessment of David's reign that emerges from biblical accounts, despite their obvious theological and literary purposes, reveals a complex figure whose achievements in military conquest, political organization, cultural innovation, and religious development were balanced by personal failures, moral compromises, and political mistakes that illustrate both the possibilities and the limitations of individual leadership in ancient societies where the boundaries between personal and political authority were often unclear and where the demands of successful governance could conflict with traditional moral and religious standards. The historical legacy of David extends far beyond the immediate political and military achievements of his reign to encompass his profound influence on religious thought, cultural development, and political theory that would continue to shape human civilization for millennia after the kingdom he established had disappeared from the political map of the ancient Near East, making him one of history's most significant and enduring figures whose impact transcends the boundaries of any single religious, cultural, or national tradition. The messianic expectations that developed around David's memory in subsequent Jewish tradition reflect both the genuine achievements of his historical reign and the idealization that typically accompanies the memory of successful leaders during periods of political decline and foreign domination, creating powerful symbols of hope and restoration that would motivate resistance movements and religious renewal throughout Jewish history, while also providing theological frameworks that would profoundly influence both Christian and Islamic thought about divine authority and human governance. The Christian appropriation and reinterpretation of Davidic imagery, particularly the identification of Jesus as the son of David and the fulfillment of messianic prophecies connected with the Davidic line, demonstrates the continuing power of David's legacy to inspire religious imagination and provide symbolic resources for understanding the relationship between divine and human authority, while also illustrating the ways in which ancient political and religious traditions could be transformed and universalized to meet the needs of new historical circumstances and diverse cultural communities. The Islamic recognition of David as a prophet and righteous ruler, reflected in Quranic narratives and subsequent theological development, acknowledges both his historical significance and his continuing relevance as a model of pious leadership and divine favor, while also demonstrating the extent to which David's influence extended beyond the boundaries of Jewish and Christian tradition to affect the development of the world's third great monotheistic religion and its understanding of the proper relationship between religious faith and political authority. The archaeological investigation of David's period, while often controversial and subject to varying interpretations, has nevertheless contributed significantly to our understanding of Iron Age society in Palestine and the broader ancient Near East, providing material evidence for the kinds of political, economic, and cultural developments that the biblical narrative associates with David's reign, while also raising important questions about the relationship between textual sources and material remains in reconstructing ancient history. The scholarly debates that surround the historical David reflect broader methodological questions about the proper relationship between archaeology and textual criticism, the reliability of ancient sources, and the extent to which modern historical methods can penetrate the complex layers of tradition, ideology, and literary artistry that characterize biblical literature, while also demonstrating the continuing relevance of ancient history for contemporary religious, political, and cultural concerns that give special urgency and significance to questions about David's historical reality and lasting significance. The literary and artistic legacy of David, reflected in countless works of music, visual art, drama, and fiction that have drawn inspiration from his story across many centuries and cultures, testifies to the enduring power of his narrative to capture human imagination and provide symbols and metaphors for understanding universal themes of leadership, faith, moral struggle, and the complex relationship between personal ambition and divine purpose that characterize human experience in all times and places. The political legacy of David, including his contributions to theories of kingship, the relationship between religious and secular authority, and the proper limits of governmental power, continues to influence contemporary political thought and practice. While his example as a leader who combined military effectiveness with cultural patronage, political pragmatism with religious commitment, and personal charisma with institutional innovation provides enduring insights into the challenges and possibilities of effective governance in complex societies. The continuing significance of Jerusalem as a religious and political symbol, rooted in David's decision to make it his capital and religious center, demonstrates the extent to which individual political decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate historical context, creating lasting institutions and symbolic associations that continue to affect international relations and religious practice thousands of years after their original establishment. The David tradition's emphasis on the importance of moral accountability for political leaders, reflected in the prophetic criticism of royal behavior and the frank acknowledgement of David's personal failures alongside his public achievements, provides important precedents for contemporary discussions about the proper relationship between personal character and public office, while also demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of human nature and political dynamics that characterizes ancient Israelite political and religious thought. The enduring power of David's story to inspire both religious devotion and secular admiration reflects its successful combination of historical realism and mythic resonance, presenting a figure who is simultaneously thoroughly human in his struggles with temptation, failure, and mortality, and yet also larger than life in his achievements, vision, and lasting influence on human civilization, creating a narrative that speaks to fundamental human aspirations while also acknowledging the tragic dimensions of power and the inevitable limitations that constrain even the most successful and well-intentioned leaders in their efforts to create lasting institutions and achieve their highest ideals.